In this video, we're going to be looking at the rise of modern metaphysics and epistemology in that period known as the Enlightenment, 1500s through the 1700s. We're going to look at how philosophical thinking evolved in terms of metaphysics and epistemology. So on the metaphysics side, we still have two ways of viewing reality, that being dualism, in other words, that the physical realm and the non-physical realm coexist together, so that there are two ways that things can exist. They can exist physically, being made up of the material world of atoms, and then there are things like thoughts, for instance, that exist in a different way, in a non-physical way, in an immaterial way. And so that if I were to say the number 7 no longer exists, you would laugh, because you would say 7 doesn't exist in a way that it cannot exist. So it's assumed there that reality has a dualistic kind of nature, that there are things that exist physically and things that exist non-physically, as opposed to the view of monism, mono, one. So a monistic view says things exist either physically or non-physical, but never both. In other words, all of reality is either going to be physical or non-physical. So that the pizza on the plate is actually just a conceptual, mental thing, as opposed to that which is made up of matter. And that, of course, is idealism, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Hobbes was one of the first during this period to suggest that everything is simply physical. Everything is material. Basic materialism. That everything that exists throughout the universe is made up of bodies, or tiny bodies, or atoms, as it were, that are in motion in space. So there's these little things in the space that they have, that they need to move around in, and that makes up everything. The moons of Saturn, Swiss cheese, and butterflies, everything that you can think of is made up of these tiny bodies in motion, including thoughts. So for Hobbes, there was no such thing as immaterial thoughts. They, in fact, are electrochemical reactions happening in the physical brain. Now, over on the epistemological side of how things were evolving, we still have the two approaches of rationalism and empiricism, the Platonic kind of based rationalism and the Aristotelian based empiricism that we've talked about before. But in the modern period, Rene Descartes comes along, and we refer to him as the father of modern rationalism. And this brilliant mathematician, Descartes, maybe you recall your Cartesian coordinates that you had to learn. That's all thanks to Descartes. And he felt like he wanted to build a philosophical system that would not be vulnerable to attack, because he's going to build it only with principles that are clear and distinct and cannot be doubted. So everything that he builds his philosophical system on is going to be so solid that it won't be subject to doubt. And this, of course, would be very important, because he would, in the process, prove the existence of God in a way that it could not be doubted. And in so doing, he would get the church off the back of scientists who were being held back by the authority of the church. And so he wanted to engage in this quest for certainty. Now, the way he does this is by engaging in what we refer to as methodological doubt. So he says, well, what cannot be doubted? And he starts with simple things like, I don't know, that the sky is blue. Well, can that be doubted? Well, yes, it can. You could look up at the sky and look at it and say, I doubt that it's blue. So he thought, well, but that's not necessarily correct. No, it's not necessarily correct. Doubting doesn't mean you have an answer. It's just saying that what you're experiencing may not be what's really out there. Well, how can you then, Descartes asked, come up with things that cannot be doubted? And he continued to pursue this, and it led to finally him asking himself some very basic, difficult questions about thought. For instance, how do I know that I'm not dreaming as I'm doing all this thinking? And of course, the answer that he came up with is, I can't know. I can't know. This conjecture that I'm dreaming, it may be true, it may not be true, but there's no way to verify it. Well, he thought, well, how about thoughts like 2 plus 2 equals 4? I mean, that's pretty straightforward. I don't think that can be doubted, can it? But he thought, well, is it possible that a evil genius is making me think that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Well, no doubt he thought that's very unlikely, but it is possible to posit such a ridiculous thing. It is possible to say, I doubt that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It doesn't say that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4, but it does mean it's possible for the human mind to doubt something like that. Well, what does that lead him to? Well, he finally realizes that there's only one thing that cannot be doubted, and that is your thinking, the reality of your thoughts. And Descartes is famous for this, what we refer to as the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I doubt, therefore I'm thinking. I doubt, therefore I think. And I think, therefore I must be, because these thoughts are going on. You see, to say I doubt that I exist proves the opposite, right? You must exist to engage in doubting. So Descartes has finally laid hold of only one thing that he can say is indubitable, and that is the reality of his thoughts, of his thinking. And that's the rationalistic perspective of Descartes. Now, on the side of empiricism, we've got the British Empiricists during this period. And starting with John Locke, we find that this brilliant and renowned physician / philosopher was one of the first to point out this idea of representative realism. So that everything that exists in the world, external to our mind, external to our bodies, everything out there, we only know about because we have brought in sensory data from that thing in through our 5 senses and then had it recreated or represented within our minds. So as in the illustration here, when you look at anything, light waves reflect off the thing and hit the optic nerve of your eye. And once they hit the optic nerve, there's no more light involved. The light does its job on the optic nerve, and then the optic nerve takes over, sends a signal, not a light wave. We're all done with the light wave at that point. Sends a different signal of some kind to the optic area of the brain where those light waves are recreated, represented. So you never get whatever is really out there in your brain. You get a representation of it. And that's how all information gets into the brain, according to Locke. So he suggests that the mind is simply a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, that gets written on by experience. As soon as we're born, experience starts to write on the brain. We bring in all kinds of stuff through the five senses, and it gets recorded. But according to Locke and the empiricists, if there's something in the brain, it got there through the five senses, that there's no other way in. All right. Well, you recall, of course, that Hobbes suggested that even all thoughts are material things, that they are in fact electrochemical events happening in the brain, and that when you think of something like the number 7, it's actually a physical event happening in the brain. But this leads us to the problem that we refer to as the mind-body problem, which is how can something that is immaterial, like, say, the concept of the number 7, which does not have mass, supposedly, many of us experience it intuitively as just being an idea, right? And that is not dependent upon physicality, and therefore it can't not exist, we said. Well, how can this immaterial thing have an effect upon that which is material, upon that which is made up of matter? For instance, like when we say or think, I must raise my arm to ask a question in class, for instance. Well, the idea results in suddenly the mass and muscles and so forth of the arm going up into the air to ask the question. How does that happen? How does the idea, the immaterial idea, somehow emerge into the physical realm and cause something to happen in the physical realm or the material realm? Difficult problem to answer. But it leads us to George Berkeley. George Berkeley said, well, if Locke is right, and I think he is, as a good empiricist, which, I depend upon observation for knowledge and nothing else, then what I'm observing is that all experiences are simply ideas, and therefore the notion of a physical or material reality is not empirically justified. It might be very handy to think of, according to Berkeley, to think of the world as existing materially outside of your mind, but we really have no way to verify such a thing, not empirically. All we have to go on are representations in our mind, ideas. All we ever experience are ideas in the mind. And therefore, he wanted to suggest that it was superfluous to talk about reality being a physical thing. All of reality for Berkeley, he was a monist or an idealist. All of reality is ideas. All reality is just thought. And he went on to suggest, he was a bishop, by the way, in the church. He went on to suggest that it's all maintained by the mind of God. It's all happening in the mind of God. And that the the feelings and experiences that we have are in fact simply ideas and not based in physical reality. Essayist Percippi, to be is to be perceived. So if you don't perceive it and have the resulting idea, then it must not exist. To exist, you have to have the idea in the mind. Well, fine. That leads us to David Hume, who says, well, if Locke and Berkeley are right, then he's a skeptic, meaning he doubts that this can be known, and he suggests that the notion of cause and effect is not empirically justified. In other words, you can't observe cause and effect. You can see things happen in conjunction, sequentially with one another. If it were billiard balls, you would see one billiard ball and then the next. But the cause and effect, some sort of transference of energy, as we say, between the first and second ball, he says you can't see that. You can't observe that in any way. So it's not empirically justified. Therefore, we can't really posit this notion of cause and effect, which of course is very important to all of science. And on it can go. Cause and effect is a part of our natural experience, but from an intuitive perspective. But Hume wants to say all you're really experiencing is constant conjunction, and you cannot suggest that that is the basis of knowledge, this notion of cause and effect. Well, he goes on to discuss ideas and facts. He wants to say that all the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds: relations of ideas and matters of fact. So we obtain all kinds of ideas about the world of experience. We bring in information through our five senses that create an impression in our mind, and then we think about them, and we have ideas about them, and we assign names and concepts to these ideas that are floating in our minds. And you might look at something and you might call it a flower, or you might call it a rose, or you might call it a symbol of love. All kinds of things that you would assign to that rose, but they are just ideas. There's nothing in the rose, that fact out there, that matter of fact of that particular flower. There's nothing in it that says it must be called a rose, or it must be a symbol of love, or that it must smell a certain way. None of that is determined by the thing out there. We simply assign to these matters of fact out there, or sensory impressions, we assign ideas to them. And in our minds, we have all these ideas that relate to one another, that we arbitrarily connect to these things out there in the world. They're matters of fact, but they aren't necessarily connected. So you might say, look, this that we're looking at here is a unicorn, and we have all kinds of ideas about it. They can fly, and they can be multicolored or whatever, and it's called a unicorn in English, and it's called a unicornio in Italian, maybe, or who knows what all the different names are we apply to this thing. But as a matter of fact, what is it? Well, we would have to point to something in the world and say this is a unicorn. This drawing is a unicorn, or you could point to a specific stuffed animal that is a unicorn, or an animation. You're not going to point to something like a horse. It doesn't exist that way. But as a matter of fact, it exists as a representation, a mythical creature or whatever in the world. But there's nothing about the unicorn concept that relates necessarily to any of the things in the real world. No ideas about the world of impressions, meaning the things that impress our minds through our five senses, can ever be shown to be logically necessary or true. Take the moon. We've been looking at the moon and as human beings and talking about it since we started to exist. But there is nothing about the moon that says it must be called the moon or Luna or whatever word you happen to have. There's no label on the moon saying this is what it is and must be. It's just up there hanging in the sky, and we assign all kinds of ideas to it very arbitrarily. But the ideas don't dictate what the moon is, you see. The ideas have no, what Hume is saying, logical or necessary connection to the thing out there. They're just things that we come up with in our minds. So no ideas, and he wants to remind us, all we really have are ideas. We don't experience anything in the external world directly. So all these ideas are not necessarily connected in a true sense, in a truly representative sense, to anything in the external world. So the British empiricists begin with Locke saying that all impressions are representations of what's out there. Berkeley says, and therefore, all representations ultimately are ideas, and that's all we ever really experience are ideas. Don't experience the external world directly. And Hume says, and therefore, it's interesting that these ideas don't tell us anything certain about reality or external reality.